In the quiet town of Stettler, Alberta, nestled in the heart of Canada's Prairie Province, the summer of 1959 would be forever stained by one of the most disturbing crimes in Canadian history. A family of 7, parents and 5 children, massacred in their sleep. The suspected killer? Their own son. This is the story of the Cook Family Massacre, a brutal crime, a nationwide manhunt, and a controversial execution that still haunts Canadian justice. On the morning of June 28, 1959, the peaceful farming community of Stettler, Alberta, was jolted awake by a nightmare. Concerned neighbors had noticed something unusual. The Cook family home, usually full of life with 5 young children, had gone completely silent. Raymond Cook, 53, and his wife, Daisy, 37, hadn't been seen for days. None of the children had appeared at school, nor had they been spotted playing in the yard. The house, eerily still, gave off an unsettling air. Responding officers approached with growing unease. At first glance, the house offered few signs of a break-in or struggle. But when they expanded their search to the surrounding property, they stumbled upon a grisly sight beneath the family's garage. Hidden inside a grease pit, typically used for vehicle maintenance, were the lifeless bodies of all 7 family members. One on top of the other, they had been hastily stashed in the cramped underground chamber. It was a grotesque mass grave, and the full horror had only just begun to unfold. The parents had each been shot with a double-barreled shotgun, likely at close range. The 5 children, Gerald, Patrick, Christopher, Kathy, and little Linda May, were bludgeoned to death, possibly with the very same weapon used to shoot their parents. All of them were still dressed in their pajamas. Blood-soaked mattresses inside the home confirmed the unthinkable. The family had likely been slaughtered as they slept. This was not a crime of impulse. It was deliberate, controlled, and remorseless. The killer had moved each body from the bedrooms to the garage, one by one, under the cover of darkness. Whether to hide the evidence or delay discovery, the act required time and a disturbingly clear mind. Within hours, police narrowed in on their first and only suspect. The day before the bodies were discovered, 23-year-old Robert Raymond Cook, Raymond's son from a previous marriage, had already drawn the attention of local police. He had been arrested on charges of obtaining goods under false pretenses after trading the family's 1958 Chevrolet station wagon for a shiny, new 1959 Impala convertible. To the officers, it seemed like a petty crime. But what they found inside the trunk of the Impala would change everything. Tucked inside were unsettling personal effects, birth certificates for each of the children, insurance policies, Raymond and Daisy's marriage certificate, and a photo album containing family pictures. There were also children's pajamas and newly purchased bed sheets. These weren't items a young man casually carried. They were artifacts of a family that no longer had a voice. Police immediately grew suspicious. Where was the family? Why was Robert traveling with such specific, intimate items? When questioned, Robert couldn't keep his story straight. At first, he claimed his father had given him over $4,000 and that the entire family had moved to British Columbia. In other versions, the details changed: where they were going, why they left, what he was told. Investigators noted that Robert's narrative seemed to shift in real time, adapting to what he believed the police already knew. This pattern would soon become a defining trait of his behavior: confident, rehearsed, but always unraveling under pressure. Initially, he was being held on minor fraud charges, but as the discovery of the bodies unfolded, the weight of the evidence, however circumstantial, became impossible to ignore. Robert Raymond Cook was no longer just a troubled young man with a criminal past. He was now the prime suspect in the brutal murder of his entire family. After his arrest, Robert Raymond Cook was transferred to the Ponoka Mental Institution for psychiatric evaluation, a standard procedure for capital cases at the time. The facility, located roughly 70 kilometers from Stettler, wasn't a maximum security prison. It was meant for observation, not containment, and that would prove to be a critical mistake. Just after midnight on July 11, 1959, Robert escaped. The exact details remain murky. Some say he overpowered a guard. Others believe he exploited a flaw in the building's security. What's certain is this: in the dead of night, the only suspect in one of the most heinous family murders in Canadian history vanished into the dark prairie landscape. What followed was one of Alberta's largest and most intense manhunts. More than 100 RCMP officers were deployed, backed by military personnel, tracking dogs and aircraft. News of the escape spread rapidly, and fear gripped the region. Was a family killer now roaming free? Authorities warned residents to stay vigilant, and checkpoints were set up across rural roads. For several days, Cook eluded capture. Then, in a strange twist, he was found hiding at a pig farm near Bashaw, Alberta, less than 30 miles from where the bodies were discovered. He surrendered without resistance. When questioned, Robert claimed he'd escaped not to flee justice, but to visit the graves of his family. It was a haunting explanation. Whether genuine grief or calculated manipulation, the line between truth and performance became increasingly blurred. In December 1959, Robert Raymond Cook stood trial in the old Red Deer courthouse, surrounded by armed guards and a cloud of public fury. Despite the deaths of 7 people, he was charged with only one count of murder, that of his father, Raymond Cook. Under Canadian law at the time, this strategy wasn't unusual. Prosecutors often chose to pursue a single capital count to secure a conviction and avoid the complications of multiple appeals. The case, however, was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. There were no fingerprints on the murder weapon, no blood on Robert's clothes, and no eyewitnesses to place him at the scene during the time of the murders. But the weight of the physical and behavioral clues was difficult to ignore. He had been found with his family's most personal belongings, had traded away their car, and couldn't give a straight answer when asked where they were. Witness testimony painted a picture of a young man with a criminal past, a history of manipulation, and an increasingly erratic personality. Prosecutors argued that Robert's motive was financial, possibly driven by resentment or desperation. His defense, meanwhile, highlighted the lack of hard forensic proof and portrayed Robert as emotionally disturbed, perhaps not even capable of fully understanding the gravity of the crime. Still, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On December 18, 1959, they returned a verdict of guilty. Robert Cook was sentenced to death by hanging. He appealed and was granted a retrial, an extremely rare legal victory. But even with new proceedings and fresh jurors, the outcome did not change. In June 1960, a second guilty verdict sealed his fate. The sentence remained: execution. By 1960, Canada had begun to move away from capital punishment in practice, even if not yet in law. Under Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, most death sentences were quietly commuted, especially when juries recommended mercy. But in Robert Cook's case, that recommendation never came. No jury member had extended him the grace of a second chance. Public opinion in Alberta had hardened. The brutality of the crime, the image of 5 bludgeoned children, left little room for doubt in the minds of most. A local survey revealed overwhelming support for Robert's execution. The community wanted closure, not questions. They wanted justice, not complexity. In the final weeks before his scheduled hanging, Robert's lawyer filed last-minute appeals, and supporters sent clemency pleas to the Solicitor General and even the Prime Minister himself. All were met with silence. Then, on November 14, 1960, a terse telegram arrived at his lawyer's office. There would be no reprieve. The sentence would be carried out as planned. Just after midnight on November 15, 1960, Robert Raymond Cook, only 23 years old, was hanged at the Fort Saskatchewan Provincial Jail. He was pronounced dead at 12:19 a.m. His execution marked the end of an era. He would become the last person ever executed in the province of Alberta. Yet, more than 6 decades later, the Cook Family Massacre still casts a long shadow. Not just because of the horror of the crime, but because of the uncertainty that lingers. Robert never confessed. He maintained his innocence until the end, going so far as to write a poem proclaiming it in the final days of his life. His words, strange and sorrowful, offered no answers, only ambiguity. David McNaughton, his defense attorney, later spoke publicly about the case. He recalled how Robert seemed genuinely horrified upon learning about the murders. McNaughton believed the evidence against him was circumstantial at best, but even he admitted that Robert's memory and behavior were unusual, perhaps fractured in ways that made the truth harder to see. Then there's Malcolm Fisher, a retired teacher who was just 9 years old when the murders happened and has spent decades studying the case. Fisher believes Robert was indeed the killer, but not in control of himself. Months before the crime, Robert had been struck in the head with a lead pipe by another inmate while serving time for theft. After the injury, his behavior became volatile and unpredictable. Robert's long record of deception didn't help his case. He changed his story depending on who was asking and what he thought they already knew. But was that the mark of a manipulative killer or a damaged young man struggling to cope with a trauma too vast to confront? Was Robert Cook a remorseless murderer or a scapegoat in a system under pressure to convict? We may never know. The Cook Family Massacre left a permanent scar on Canadian criminal history. A quiet town was shattered, a family was erased, and a nation watched as a young man was led to the gallows. Whether justice was served or a mistake was made, only history can judge. This was Unlocked Confidential. Subscribe for more serious investigative looks into crimes that time tried to forget.